Hello again, my name is Brandon, and I am continuing my series where I talk about some of my favorite books on my bookshelves. I like to read horror and thrillers, but mostly I just like it when things get dark and weird. And yeah, let's get into it. The Hike by Drew Magary is about a guy that goes on a hike one day and basically falls down the rabbit hole and finds himself in one crazy, dangerous, life-threatening situation after the other. And of all the hundreds upon hundreds of books that I have ever featured on my account, this is probably my most popular recommendation, the most well-received one. More people tell me that they have really enjoyed this book, or it's like one of their new favorite books more than any other. And I can for sure see why. It definitely leans more into fantasy than outright horror, although things do get dark and it is pretty violent at times and the ending is absolutely insane. But yeah, it is a really vivid, imaginative, just absolutely insane adventure. Monster of Ellenhaven by Jennifer Giesbrecht is about a monster and a magician with differing agendas that join forces and all hell breaks loose. And it's set in this really vivid gothic world that kind of reminded me of a mix between the games Dishonored and Bloodborne. Bloodborne is one of my favorite books, so when I read it for the first time, I was like, oh my gosh, let's get Bloodborne vibes. I have a Hunter's Mark tattooed. I was obsessed with it. I was obsessed with the setting. Very, very atmospheric. This one is really short, only 150 pages or so, and I flew through it in an afternoon when I read it for the first time, and it is dark and gritty. This is a very grimy, brutal world, and yeah, some pretty uncomfortable and questionable things happen in this one. Let Me In, or it's also called Let the Right One In by Jonavidi Langfist, is about a little boy who's relentlessly bullied who starts to suspect that his new next door neighbor might be a vampire. I have seen both movie adaptations for this book. I haven't seen the series yet, but the book is so disturbing in comparison to the movies. I was not expecting just how graphic and in your face some of the scenes were. There are a couple scenes that are unfortunately seared into my memory forever. It's depraved at times, which again, it just was not expecting. It really, really goes there. Marian Awakening of Terror by Nat Cassidy is about a woman that's experiencing some pretty troubling changes to her body, and she's not sure if it's because she's getting older and going through menopause, or if there's something more sinister happening. One day she's forced to quit her job in New York City and move back to her hometown to take care of her sick aunt, and pretty soon after she gets there, people start dying. Nat Cassidy does a really good job at infusing dark humor in his books. It's almost got this flippant, kind of dry humor, kind of similar to Stephen King, but it really, really works for me. And so even though there is some really dark and messed up scenes in this, very soon afterwards you'll be laughing. There's a lot of very unique and well-written characters in this one, especially the main character's aunt. She's a piece of work, to put it lightly, but I think Nat Cassidy is one of the best writers working today, and he is definitely one of my favorites. The Devil Takes You Home by Gavino Iglesias is about a hitman that decides to take one more job before retirement, but of course things do not go to plan. This is a really great mix between horror and thriller. Things get extremely dark in this one. The violence especially was so graphic and had me cringing often. I feel like one day this book is going to be adapted into a movie because it reads very cinematically. I think it does a really good job at balancing the neo-noir, crime thriller, supernatural horror aspects very well. In The Gone World, the end of the world is looming and inevitable. They know exactly when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. They basically have a doomsday clock and they are trying their best to prevent it. And one of the ways that they're trying is there's basically these time-traveling agents, these time-traveling detectives that go across the timeline to try to find ways, any way that they can, to either stop or slow down the countdown. And our main character is one of those time-traveling agents, and she's investigating a brutal murder that is somehow tied to everything and might be the key to solving the world's problem. This is another one of those stories that does a really good job at blending multiple genres, so it's a crime thriller, sci-fi, and a supernatural horror story. It is very brutal and dark. It kind of gave me an existential crisis, just the thought of knowing the end of the world is going to happen and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn is about a reporter with a very dark past that is tasked to go back to her hometown to cover the murder of two young girls, and while there she is forced to reunite with her extremely dysfunctional family. And one of my favorite books in horror and thrillers is The Dysfunctional Family, and this one in particular is just so messy and uncomfortable. It gave me a visceral reaction reading it. Reading about this family dynamic. I thought this does a really great job at exploring different mental health struggles, and the main character especially is very flawed and very layered and honestly pretty relatable. I need Gillian Flynn to come out with more books. It is criminal that she only has 3 feature-length novels. In The Call by Peadar O'Gillen, Ireland is sealed off from the rest of the world, and children at some point in their lives are called. Basically, they're teleported to this nightmare world called a Greyland that's inhabited by this terrifying race of fae. And this is a YA book, and it definitely reads like it, but it features some of the most nightmare-inducing body horror that I have ever read. The descriptions of the fae are just so ghastly and menacing and haunting. And there is a sequel, although it's not quite as good, but it is a really great duology overall. And yeah, just a very freaky. In Boy Parts by Eliza Clark, this photographer basically gets off by photographing conventionally unattractive men in very dehumanizing positions. She happens upon an opportunity of a lifetime for her career when she's given her own exhibition, and the story is basically a very slow but sure descent into madness. This is one of those books where the main character is intentionally unlikable, but I love reading books where the main characters are kind of just awful, and the main character in this one was particularly off-putting, but I just loved it so much. Give me a flawed main character over someone that has their stuff together any day of the week. Hollow Kingdom by Kira Jane Buxton is about a domesticated talking crow named Shitherd and his dog Dennis that take on the zombie apocalypse in Seattle. And this one is absolutely hilarious. Definitely one of the most funniest books that I have ever read, this and the sequel. It is also pretty sad and devastating at times, but more than anything, it is just funny. It's very much like a satire on our culture. It's filled with all sorts of like pop culture references, and the crow's owner before the zombie apocalypse was like a conspiracy theorist nut job, and so the crow also has some of those ideas on the world. It's just a really fun and funny read. Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones is about a group of friends that are being slowly hunted down one by this vengeful entity after a terrible hunting accident from their past. This one has these bouts of really unexpected but extremely graphic violence, and all of Stephen Graham Jones's books are kind of like that. And speaking of cinematic books, I would love to see this turned into a movie someday, because there is one scene towards the end, it's like a basketball scene. Oh my gosh, it is so vivid and intense. Last Days by Brian Evanson is about this detective with a very dark past that is kidnapped by this dismemberment cult and is forced to help solve a murder. And as you can imagine by the dismemberment cult aspect of it all, it is extremely violent. A lot of very intense graphic body horror. It has this like kind of like darkly comedic edge that even though you're reading something like super messed up, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, you can't help but laugh. And I don't know if all copies of this book are the same, but definitely skip the introduction written by Peter Straub because it spoils the whole thing. And finally, Geek Love by Catherine Dunn. Whenever I talk about Last Days by Brian Evanson, people are always like, that reminds me of Geek Love. And yeah, for sure. This is about a family of carnies as they travel across the US doing shows and as they garner a cult following and all the craziness that follows because of that. This one also kind of has a darkly comedic feel. It is such a tragic read. It really ripped my heart out in the end. It also features some just like completely evil characters that I could not hate enough. The story has a lot of layers, and honestly, I feel like it's the type of story that requires like multiple readings to fully get the full gist of exactly what happened. Also extremely divisive, so just keep that in mind. But it really worked for me, and I will never forget Ollie. Yeah, that's it for now. I'm going to continue my favorite series, but I'm going to talk about some of the books that I don't own physically, so some of the books that I've read as ebooks and audiobooks. Yeah, definitely let me know if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you in the next one.